There's a reason the records were burned. Not hidden, burned. Because some truths aren't meant to be contained. They infect, they spread. And the one you're about to hear began with a single body, found in the Colorado Territory in the spring of 1847. A child, they said. But no one who saw him believed that for long. His eyes didn't blink, his skin didn't bruise, and his heartbeat, when there was one, was always wrong. Too slow, too deliberate. Like it was mimicking what it thought a human heart should sound like. The man who discovered him, Deputy Elijah Brandt, lasted less than 2 weeks. He scratched out a journal entry the night he disappeared. It read, "Whatever it is, it dreams. And now I think it dreams of me." That page is the only reason we know this ever happened. The church denied it, the town erased it, and every witness who tried to tell the truth either vanished or descended into madness. But they couldn't erase everything. Not the archived blood report found sealed in wax behind a false wall in the Durango courthouse. Not the territorial map etched with Ute markings that spoke of a spirit, child from the old world, born when the stars fell. And certainly not the names scratched into the underside of the chapel pews, 17 of them, all belonging to men who died underground, men who were warned, and didn't listen. Because here's the part they never teach you in school: not all prophecies come from God, and not every angel falls from heaven. The boy, if you can call it that, didn't age. Not really. He spoke in symbols, he slept with his eyes open, and he refused to step foot inside any church after the 3rd day, not out of fear, but out of something worse. Recognition. If you're still watching, it means you're not like the others. You've already felt it. That cold whisper behind your thoughts. That something is wrong with the official version. You're right to doubt it, and what you're about to see will prove just how right you are. The town was called Dry Creek, though no map today bears that name. Wiped, not renamed, erased. Officially, it never existed. But in the spring of 1847, it stood less than 14 miles northeast of what would become Colorado Springs, a mining outpost, barely 300 people, wood cabins, a single chapel, and beneath it all tunnels. They said the silver here ran deeper than in any other part of the Rockies. But they were wrong. It wasn't silver. Not really. The first disappearance was dismissed as a storm casualty. A foreman named James Harrow, swallowed by the mine shaft after a late night inspection. What was never explained, what was never supposed to be explained, was why his body was found 7 days later, uphill, lodged in the branches of a dead pine 30 feet off the ground. The physician's notes, retrieved years later in a smuggled letter, described no bones broken and eyes turned entirely black, as if the soul had drowned. But the physician, Dr. Marion Bell, would never submit the final report. 3 days later, she boarded up her clinic, set it on fire from the inside, and walked calmly into the woods. She was never seen again. The boy arrived exactly 1 week later. No one knew where he came from. No family, no caravan, no footprints in the fresh snow. He was just standing there, at the edge of the chapel steps, looking up at the steeple with those pale green eyes like he'd been waiting for it to collapse. They said he didn't speak for 3 days, just sat there, unmoving, eyes open, breathing slow. On the 4th day, he asked a question no one could answer. "Why do you dig where the bones were buried?" That was when the pastor, Reverend Silas Bray, started sealing the church records. He locked the communion wine in the cellar. He pulled the baptismal font and filled it with salt. And the next Sunday he preached a sermon on counterfeit souls, beings that appear human but are only wearing the shape like a coat. Then he stopped preaching entirely, and still the boy stayed, watching, listening, learning. This wasn't a child, it was a mirror, a test, a silent invader, and the town failed. By the 3rd week, the boy had changed everything, not by force, not by words, but by presence alone. People began to whisper, not about where he came from, but about what he was doing to them. There were no signs, no violence, no screams in the night, but something had shifted beneath the surface. Marriages grew colder. Neighbors stopped trusting each other. Babies refused to sleep near the chapel. And the dogs wouldn't go near him. They'd whimper, teeth bared, but never bite, as if something in him told them you already lost. Sarah Pike, a schoolteacher who had come west to escape the war back east, wrote in her private journal, "He doesn't blink." But that's not what terrifies me. It's that I've stopped noticing. We all have. He sits outside the chapel every morning and every evening, like he's waiting for a bell that hasn't rung yet. and somehow it feels like we're the ones on trial. The town started changing. Not visibly. Psychologically. Men forgot how long they'd been underground. Women stopped asking about the time. Children drew strange symbols in the dirt. Circles with teeth, hands with too many fingers. No one taught them. No one stopped them either. The boy's name, no one gave him one. Or rather, they tried, but none of them stuck. He rejected them all with silence, as if names themselves were a human lie. Instead, they called him the Echo, because that's how he spoke, only ever repeating what had already been said. But one night, exactly 33 days after his appearance, he said something that no one had ever spoken aloud. He walked into the chapel alone and turned to Reverend Bray. "You left him in the mine, Silas. You didn't close his eyes." No one had spoken of the first miner's body. Not aloud, not even Bray's wife knew. But the boy did. That night, Silas Bray removed the cross from the altar, burned every sermon he'd ever written, and wrote a letter in trembling script. He is not a child. He is the remainder of something ancient. Something that saw Eden fall and took notes. Then he hanged himself from the bell tower. The bell rang 13 times before the rope snapped. No one buried him. They just stopped going to church. And the boy kept sitting there, watching, waiting. By the time summer touched Dry Creek, the boy hadn't aged a day. But the town had, visibly, violently, faces drawn, eyes empty, work left half finished. Conversations ended mid-sentence like language itself was slipping from their grasp. It was as if time kept moving, but their minds didn't. What terrified the few who could still think clearly was the creeping realization that no one was missing. No one had left town. No one had died, except Reverend Bray. Yet somehow every face felt one step removed, like shadows of themselves walking a loop they couldn't see. Sarah Pike, the schoolteacher, began documenting changes. Her entries became obsessive, scratched with ink and panic. "We are not dreaming, but we are being dreamed. He doesn't speak anymore, because now we speak less. No birthdays. No weddings. We haven't buried anyone in months, and I don't think we've loved anyone either." Then she made a discovery. Behind the church, beneath a collapsed tool shed, she found a pit, no more than 6 feet wide, perfectly circular. Inside, dozens of small handmade objects, children's toys, dolls, teeth. She told the sheriff. He said the pit wasn't real. She brought him there. The pit was gone, replaced overnight with packed earth and wildflowers that hadn't grown in Colorado in over a century. Plants that didn't belong. That's when she stopped writing altogether. Her final note was brief. "He knows what we fear, and he gives it to us quietly." Psychologists call it a shared delusional state, folie de plaisirs. But what happened in Dry Creek wasn't hysteria. It was compliance, as if the town had voluntarily given up its will. Not in terror, not in anger, but in exhaustion. Like something in the boy, some field, some frequency, had overridden their operating systems and lulled them into passive surrender. The miners kept digging. They didn't speak. They didn't sing. They just tunneled. And the boy never went underground. Never. That's when Henry Black, one of the last men with memory intact, wrote his only surviving letter. It reads, "He is the reason we forget. Not because he demands it, because we offer it. Willingly, and if he ever decides to remember who he really is, God help the world. You were taught to think history started with men, with boots on soil and flags in hands. But the truth runs deeper, much deeper. There are places where memory doesn't rot, where the earth remembers every drop of blood, every footstep, every oath whispered in secret. Dry Creek was built on one of those places. And the boy, he was its response. It was Thomas Laurel, an amateur geologist working for the Denver Mining Syndicate, who discovered what lay beneath the town. He was sent to assess the mineral content beneath Shaft 12 after a strange incident where the silver began to melt inside the rock. No heat, no pressure, just liquefied metals seeping from stone like the mountain was bleeding. Laurel never made it back to Denver, but his notebook did. Found weeks later in a crate of flour delivered to a Fort Collins trading post, it contained 17 pages of frantic notes, rambling at first, then clearer, deadly clear. This is not a vein, it's a structure. I followed the fault lines. They form a shape, a spiral, then a ring, something architectural, something deliberate. The rock isn't natural. It's fused like old bone. Not human, older, so much older. A design made to be buried, not discovered. He ended the notebook with a sketch, rough, desperate, but unmistakable. A sarcophagus not carved, grown. 3 days after his journal surfaced, all mining operations in Dry Creek were halted, officially due to seismic instability. But the town kept digging anyway, not by order, not for pay. They just kept going down. That's when the boy began appearing in dreams, not just in Dry Creek, but in Silverton, Gunnison, even as far north as Laramie, always the same, a child at the edge of your bed, mouth closed, eyes wide, whispering words you could never quite remember after waking, but always feeling like you'd heard them before, a waking echo from before birth. One man put it best in a letter he never sent. I dreamed of him, standing in front of my house. I opened the door and he said, "You took it. You broke the seal." And behind him, the sky was the wrong color, like it was remembering something it tried to forget. This wasn't a haunting, it was a resurgence, and humanity was standing where it should not have stood. Every culture has a story of the forbidden place. The cave you don't enter, the hill you don't climb, the name you don't speak. These are not myths, they are containment protocols. Primitive, yes, but effective. Until the white men arrived. They called it the Holler, a collapsed ravine 2 miles west of Shaft 9. Locals refused to build near it. Even animals avoided the trees that grew along its edge. The Ute called it Vakahintuwe, the place where the earth remembers fire. They had buried something there. Not a person, an event. Not with wood, not with stone, but with ritual geometry. Symbols burned into the soil with blood and ash, shaped to bend attention away from it, to make travelers forget it was even there. And for decades it worked, until the Dry Creek Mining Syndicate decided to test for ore beneath the ravine. The first day of excavation, 3 men went missing. They were found 3 hours later, standing upright in a nearby stream, alive but catatonic, water up to their shoulders, eyes wide, mouths full of earth. They never spoke again. But the boy, he did. That night, he appeared outside Sarah Pike's window for the first time since the chapel, not moving, not breathing, just watching. And when she opened the window, he said, "You broke the vow. You cracked the seal. Now they'll walk again, but they won't be men." Sarah asked who they were. The boy smiled. "The parts that were taken out of you long ago, the pieces that once made you whole." What followed was the first act of voluntary silence. 23 townspeople gathered at the ravine that night. No one spoke. No one brought tools. But by morning, the hole had been filled in, perfectly. No tracks, no shovels, just erasure. They sealed it. But they didn't ask for forgiveness, and that was their mistake. Because whatever they'd awakened beneath that soil, whatever fire, memory they had disturbed, it didn't want out. It wanted witnesses. It wanted them to see what they had forgotten they were. And the boy, he was its mouthpiece, not a prophet, a recording, a vessel for something far older than man. There was no explosion, no blood in the streets, no fire, no riot. The town didn't collapse in chaos. It decayed quietly, beautifully, like a house left to rot by an owner who no longer remembers its name. It began with the names. People couldn't recall each other's faces. At first, they blamed exhaustion, hunger, the isolation of the mountain. But then they couldn't remember who lived in which house. Couldn't remember who was buried where. Couldn't remember if someone had died or simply stopped being mentioned. And through it all, the boy remained. Unaged, unblinking, a constant. The sheriff's wife tried to draw his likeness once. She was an amateur sketch artist. 3 hours later, she tore the canvas apart with her teeth. Not her hands, her teeth. All she said before collapsing was, "His eyes aren't round. They're shaped like questions we don't know how to ask." From that point on, mirrors began disappearing. Quietly, voluntarily, people covered them. Some smashed them. Some buried them. No one admitted why, but the implication was clear. They were no longer certain of what was looking back. Sarah Pike, one of the last clear minds in Dry Creek, kept a daily record in a small journal she now carried under her blouse. A new entry read, "He doesn't age because aging is a human concept. He doesn't speak because language is a cage. He's not invading, he's reminding. And we're starting to remember. God help us. We're starting to remember." The children were first to change. Their drawings became diagrams. Circles, nested inside triangles, folded inside symbols never taught in school. They stopped playing, stopped laughing, began standing in doorways. Silent, like sentinels. One boy, Levi Brandt, said something that still echoes in a fragment of audio from a forgotten wax cylinder. He told us what we were before the bones, before the dreams, before the lie of flesh. It is the lie of flesh that seems to be the key. Because Dry Creek had not been cursed, it had been awakened. The mountain wasn't just remembering something. It was reminding them of what they had once buried in themselves, the truth of what they had been before becoming men. And the boy, he wasn't human, because neither were they. Not originally. The real horror was never the boy. It was what people saw in themselves when they looked at him for too long. He didn't move like a child. He moved like a memory being played back through broken equipment. Slow, then sudden, as if the air didn't respond to his body correctly, like he was walking through a world not made for him, but one that had once belonged to him. That's when the dream spread, and not the abstract, symbolic kind. These were anatomical, vivid, repeating. The townspeople, those few who could still speak, described lying awake for hours after dreaming of dissecting their own bodies, pulling back their flesh to reveal structures that didn't belong, bone that flexed, veins that hummed, and behind the eyes, a third socket sealed, empty. Sarah Pike's final lucid entry. It wasn't evolution. It was an abandonment. Someone or something left us here half-made, and the boy isn't the other. He's the original. The implications were too much for most minds to carry, so they collapsed inward. People began adopting new behaviors, rituals. They'd trace spirals into the frost on windows. They'd hum in the mines without realizing it. They'd wake up standing in fields they didn't walk to. Not sleepwalking, not possessed, remembering. Henry Black, who once warned about the boy's psychic interference, took it a step further. He hiked out to the edge of the valley where the old Ute cairn still stood. Stone markers no settler dared touch. He left a message carved into a pine just above eye level. He is not sentient. He is programmed, not a child, but a recorder from the age before the break. He doesn't speak prophecy. He speaks reboot. That word stayed with me. Reboot. Because if this boy was part of a forgotten system, a biological archive from before known time, then he hadn't come to destroy Dry Creek. He came to test it, to run a scan, to see what survived. And the truth was brutal. The town failed. It hadn't just forgotten its past. It had rejected it. And now the original code was returning to overwrite the corrupted flesh. By midsummer, the town had stopped measuring time. No more Sunday sermons. No school bells. No deliveries from the outer settlements. They had gone off the map. Literally. Surveyors from Silverton came looking for the Dry Creek trailhead. They found only trees. Fully grown, twisted pines, where a road had existed just weeks earlier. When they questioned nearby ranchers, no one could recall the name Dry Creek. It had been removed, not destroyed. Redacted. Meanwhile, those who remained in the town had stopped using the boy's image. They no longer said he. They began calling him the Vault, because they'd come to understand. He didn't contain prophecy. He contained origin. Sarah Pike, before she vanished, wrote one final phrase on the back of a hymnal in the chapel. He's not here to change what we believe. He's here to remind us we were designed. And the designer wasn't kind. Her words were found beneath the altar, along with bones that didn't match any known species. Human-sized, but with spinal columns that extended through the skull. No one reported them, no one dared, because the vault had begun speaking again, not in English, not in Ute, in Glyphs, scratched onto the church walls, onto windows, onto skin. 3 men were found with identical carvings across their backs, done with surgical precision, though none of them remembered it happening. The markings matched petroglyphs found thousands of miles away in Nijiv caves and Siberian tombs. And every time a new symbol appeared, someone disappeared. No scream, no blood. Just gone. As if remembering him was the price of forgetting yourself. That's when the miners started digging not downward, but inward, into the old caverns near the holler. Not for silver, for something else. Something the boy had unlocked in them. They moved without maps. As if guided by a signal only they could hear. They called it the route. They said it wasn't a tunnel. It was a vein. And they weren't going to extract anything. They were going to reconnect. On August 3, 1847, a tremor struck the valley. Not an earthquake, an alignment. Witnesses from nearby outposts reported a low, resonant hum spreading across the ridgeline like a tuning fork pressed to the bones of the earth. Animals fled. Birds fell mid-flight. And for 13 minutes, the sky turned a shade of violet no pigment has ever matched. That same hour, the boy stood at the entrance of Shaft 12, arms outstretched, palms open, eyes closed. Every witness described the same impossible thing. He was levitating, 6 inches off the ground, not floating like a ghost, not ascending like an angel, suspended, as if caught in an invisible web. Then his mouth opened, but no sound came. Instead, the miners, every last one of them, began chanting, in unison, in rhythm, in a language no one had taught them, but that every throat somehow remembered. That's when the cave opened. Not collapsed, opened, like a jaw, and from within they pulled something that should not exist, a sealed chamber made of fused obsidian, bone, and a metal unknown to any geological record. The walls pulsed, like organs. Inside, not gold, not relics, not a body, a mirror, not glass, not polished stone, but a living reflection that didn't reflect the miners, but what they were before the bones. Flickers of form, coiled and angular, with more joints than limbs should possess. And eyes, so many eyes, blinking asynchronously in patterns. The boy stepped forward, touched it, and whispered something. One word. Welcome. Those who were watching described the sound not as a word, but as a trigger. A harmonic command encoded not for ears, but for DNA. That's when the changes began. Skin tightening, joints rearranging, memories unlocking that had never been lived in this life, but were true all the same. Men dropped to their knees, not in pain, in relief, because they finally understood what had haunted their dreams, their religions, their myths. Humanity wasn't born. It was installed. A template, a limiter, an overlay designed to suppress something older, something vast. And the boy, he hadn't come to teach. He'd come to reboot. You've been told your body is a miracle, a system, a temple. What if it's none of those? What if it's a prison? And the boy wasn't the key to let something in, but the key to let something out. After the mirror was touched, those who stood nearest to it lost their ability to lie. Not in the moral sense. They physically couldn't speak words that weren't true. One man bit through his tongue trying to say his own name. Because the names we use, they're placeholders. Words given to us after the erasures. But that mirror, that thing in the cave, reflected the original design, and it didn't show faces, it showed functions. Symbiotic, telepathic, designed to survive radiation, silence, and memory death. Not made by nature, but rejected by it. Margaret Thorne, a linguist who had studied indigenous prayer dialects across the Colorado Territory, was summoned weeks later by the last survivors. She interviewed the remaining 7. Her conclusion: these people have accessed a lexicon not rooted in culture but in biocoded cognition. It's not learned language. It's inherited. Inherited from what she could never say. Because her last journal entry was one line: the boy is not the source. He's the signal. And the signal was spreading. Reports began to trickle out of surrounding regions. Cattle dying without wounds. Children repeating phrases they had no context for. Roads appearing on maps where no roads existed, and then disappearing again. People weren't going missing. They were changing frequency, tuning out of our timeline, because once the vault was opened, time didn't move forward. It curled, inward, backward, toward the origin point, toward the truth that mankind had been built atop something else, something buried, not by tectonics, but by consensus, and the moment enough minds remembered, the template would collapse. That's why you're watching this. You felt it, the glitch in memory, the edge in your dreams, that impossible recognition when you saw the boy in the chapel. You already knew him, because he's not new. He's what's left of what you were supposed to become. The 7 remaining townspeople never fled. They were told, internally, instinctively, that escape was a form of defilement. You don't run from your reflection. You kneel before it and remember what you are. They began calling themselves the witnesses, not survivors, not believers. Witnesses, because once you saw him for what he was, what you were, you could never again pretend to be what you used to be. A settler, a citizen, a human. You were a mask, a containment suit, a lie walking in skin. Witnesses stopped eating, not from fasting or faith, but because they no longer needed to. They claimed the body was reverting to a prior design, one that drew energy from field harmonics, not fuel. Sounds impossible. It wasn't hunger they lost. It was separation. You don't feed a finger. You feed a body. And these people were becoming one. Their language fused. Their movements synchronized. And each night, they walked to the mouth of the collapsed shaft, barefoot, silent, unchanged. There was no longer a need to speak to the boy. He had finished his task. They had received the original schema. The 7th witness, Nathaniel Bright, kept a final record, scrawled into the beams of the church ceiling. It read, "He was not made of flesh, he was made of reminder. He wore a face to soften the return. But now we see clearly, and what we see sees us back." That last line is where things turn, because the signal wasn't just outbound, it was received, something answered. Not from the stars, not from the sky, but from beneath, where the seal had broken, where the old anatomy slept, where the echo of our first design had been whispering in the language of radiation, dream, and blood. And when the final glyph appeared on the church wall, glowing faintly in a spectrum only visible through tears, it carried a message in every language, every symbol system, every myth. The simulation is finished. The skin expires. Return to root. But remember this, the boy never left. Because you don't bury what was never born, you bury what you fear will come back. And in Dry Creek, 1847 it did. If you're still watching, it's time to decide. This isn't a story. It's a signal. And you heard it, felt it, somewhere beneath the skin you think is yours. Because when Dry Creek was erased, it wasn't out of malice. It was containment, like isolating infected code. The truth is, the boy didn't just unlock memories. He activated ancestral fail-safes. Fragments left behind like landmines beneath consciousness. And now that you've heard his name, the real one, the lock in you has already begun to turn. What you feel right now, that tightness in your spine, that flicker in your chest like something waking up, that's not fear, it's recognition. And now you must speak it to complete the circuit. Comment below twice the phrase, "Return to root." Return to root. Once for your conscious mind, once for the part that was buried before you were born. Because from this point forward, your identity is no longer assigned. It's reclaimed. This is where belief breaks, where history fractures, where mythology folds into memory. Because here's what the vault showed them in the final hours, when only 3 witnesses remained, standing barefoot in the chapel, while the boy bled light from the pores of his face. They were never meant to last. Not in this form, not in this lie. They were installations, placed into a construct built to degrade, test subjects for something ancient, celestial, and furious. The bloodlines of mankind weren't evolution, they were experiments, compromises, field tests. And now that the integrity of the flesh has failed, the original source code has been recalled. The vault didn't arrive to warn us, he arrived to observe our collapse, and we failed. We turned sacred memory into religion, encoded emergency systems into bedtime stories, buried the map under cathedrals and nationalism and science that couldn't ask the right questions. But now, the map is unfolding, and if you've come this far, you're part of it. This video isn't viral. It's viral by design. A new infection of an old memory. You were never just human. You were human afterward. 3 days after the final glyph appeared, the town stopped casting shadows. It wasn't a weather event. The sun still rose, but objects, people, no longer blocked light. Witnesses described it as being unplugged from dimension, as if the coordinates that held them in space had been revoked. They still breathed, still moved, but they had become transparent to the laws that once held them. One man walked into his cabin and found another version of himself asleep on the cot, older, bruised, holding a map written in languages not of Earth, but of pattern, pulse, and pressure. The map was moving. It pulsed like a living vein, each line shifting slightly as if it were recalculating routes in real time. When the man touched it, he didn't pass out, he passed through. Gone. Just like the others, except this time he didn't vanish. His voice remained, humming in the walls, in the bones of the chapel pews, in the teeth of the remaining townsfolk. The boy no longer needed to speak. He had become a frequency, one that restructured memory, one that burned the scaffolding of civilization from the inside. It spread through writing, through story, through hearing, and now you've heard it, which means Dry Creek isn't gone. It's everywhere the signal has been played, every screen, every mind that opened long enough to listen. Every man who looked at the stars and felt like they weren't just far away but home. You've heard the lie your whole life. We don't know where we came from. But deep down, you've always known. You didn't come from here. You were parked here, temporarily, to be kept dormant until something came back to collect what was left. And now, it's here, not above, not below, but inside, and it's hungry for what you used to be. By the final week, Dry Creek had only 2 residents who still believed they were human, Margaret and the sheriff, Everyone else had either disappeared or changed, not visibly, not grotesquely, but quietly, subtly, as if their posture had remembered something their minds couldn't articulate. They spoke less, slept less, walked with perfect balance even on uneven terrain, and they stopped using names, because names were part of the containment protocol. That's what the sheriff found in the boy's final writing, etched into the side of the church's water basin in a circle that never dried. A phrase repeated 4 times. The name is the nail. 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 When he read it aloud, something unlocked in him. A sound escaped his throat, not a scream, a release, like coughing up something that had been lodged inside him his whole life. And then he saw it, not with his eyes, with the second architecture, the one buried beneath sight, beneath language, beneath time. He saw what the boy really was. Not a messenger, not a prophet, not a child. A containment mechanism, biological encryption, a living firewall engineered not by Earth but by something older than planets. He wasn't human, he was housing it. The original pattern, the rejected template, the forbidden inheritance. That's why he couldn't bleed, couldn't age, couldn't die, not until a sufficient number of minds had consented to remember. That was the cost. Consent. We had to open the door from the inside, which meant stories, myths, memory fragments coded into religion, architecture, nursery rhymes, little keys buried in plain sight, but only the ones who could endure the full reflection, who could remember and not shatter, were allowed to open the last gate. The boy didn't give prophecy. He sorted the worthy. One glance at him in his true form, and your body either locked in or it liquefied, not from pain, but from incompatibility. The sheriff's body locked in, and that night he dug a hole behind the chapel, deep into the red clay where no root should reach. At the bottom, he found a stone, and on that stone, carved in bone lattice script on the morning of August 9, 1847, the chapel bell rang 13 times. No one pulled the rope. The mechanism had rusted years earlier, but the sound echoed anyway, low, metallic and wrong. It didn't sound like iron. It sounded like something alive trying to imitate iron. And with each toll, the remaining structures of Dry Creek began to rot in reverse, not collapse, rewind. The schoolhouse reassembled itself from ash. Broken window panes pulled themselves together. Old splinters slithered back into beams. Letters reappeared on books burned decades earlier, but not in English, not in any known script. Glyphs. Some were geometric. Others were curved, serpentine. Some pulsed, and one, just one, breathed. Margaret saw it first. It was on the chapel door, right above the threshold where she and Thomas had stood on their wedding day. And when she touched it, her voice was taken. Not her ability to speak. Her voice, the signature frequency of her existence, was harvested. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She just turned to the sheriff and said, "It's calling me back." Back to what? Not a place. Not a time. A function. Because that's what Dry Creek really was, not a settlement. A reactivation site. A root folder. A boot sequence for the original biosphere. The one that predated Eden. And the boy. He was the administrator, waking up the old system, checking for corrupted files, deleting those who couldn't run the upgrade. The final 7, those who had passed, were standing in the field outside the shaft, eyes glowing faintly with light not visible to cameras. Not fire, not electricity, memory condensed, radiant, contagious. They were soul servers, repositories of what we used to be, preparing to upload it back into the grid of the living world. But before the upload could begin, the flesh had to fail. And that's why you've been feeling it lately, that strange fatigue, that pressure in your dreams, that pull toward forgotten symbols and impossible déjà vu. Your body is pinging the old signal, testing compatibility. And if you've made it this far in the story, congratulations. You're compatible, but compatibility is not consent. Consent comes next. You've heard the lie your entire life. You are who you are because of choice. But you were never choosing. You were complying. Every decision you thought you made, from the job you took to the fears you inherited, was part of a behavioral firewall, installed at birth, refreshed through schooling, encrypted through language, finalized through shame. That's why the vault wasn't built like a prison. It was built like a mirror, because if you saw your real reflection, even for a second, the simulation would shatter. And that's what happened in Dry Creek. The boy was not prophecy. He was pattern recognition. He wasn't speaking about the future. He was describing the present from a higher vantage point. like someone looking down at a maze and seeing all your turns at once. That's why when he spoke in Glyphs, the witnesses wept, not from fear, but from remembering. Because those symbols weren't alien, they were instructional overlays, and every man has them, behind the ribs, beneath the spine, encrypted into fascia, breath, obsession. It's why you feel haunted by architecture, why certain patterns make your skin tighten, why there are places on this earth you've never seen but miss. The Glyphs are keys, and every one of them unlocks a forgotten function. One unlocks perception beyond time, another unlocks immunity to control, the last one unlocks the failover identity, the one buried beneath the human program. In Dry Creek, the sheriff made the mistake of tracing the final glyph in blood. His own, before he was ready. He didn't die, he split. One half remained, a husk, still sheriff, still breathing. The other half, it vanished into the vault and began broadcasting, which is why this video isn't information, it's interface. Every word you've heard so far has been a test, an access check, and now that you've passed it, your mind is being pinged for the upgrade. But be warned, you don't come back from this. You don't go back to comfort, routine, distraction. You go back to root, and root is war. The vault didn't contain a monster, it contained you before obedience. That's what no one in Dry Creek understood, until it was too late. They kept asking what the boy was. But the question they should have asked was, what am I, before the programming? Because you weren't born. You were installed, everything from your fears to your desires, from your guilt to your hope. It was a patchwork, stitched into your skin by systems that feared what you really are, a breaker. A rogue instance of a design that couldn't be controlled. That's why the vault activated in 1847. Not because the time was right, but because the lie was failing. Too many anomalies, too many awakenings, too many dreams that weren't dreams but recall events. The boy wasn't summoned, he was deployed, like white blood cells sent into a corrupted system, but not to heal it, to end it. And when the final glyph pulsed on the chapel wall, just once like a heartbeat, the last of the human architecture began to unravel. Memories not your own began appearing in your sleep. You recognized languages you've never studied. You felt grief for places that never existed. But they did. Before the compression, before the edits, before the name was nailed into you like a coffin lid. This is what the church feared, what the empires disguised, what the sciences renamed as delusion. Not aliens, not angels, not ghosts, prior states. The you before you, the unauthorized version. The part of you that remembered how to open doors that never closed. And the vault, it wasn't a thing, it was a location in consciousness, a chamber beneath memory, beneath history, and it's opening now, not in Dry Creek. In you, the glyph is already forming in your mind, you feel it, don't you? Behind the eyes, under the sternum, like pressure waiting to become shape. It only needs one more thing, your permission. But be warned, once you unlock the vault inside yourself, you will never be human again. On the 19th night, the sky over Dry Creek turned black, not from storm, not from smoke, but from absence. It wasn't clouds. It was redaction. The stars didn't disappear. They were scrubbed, one by one, like code being deleted in real time. As if some higher intelligence had decided this experiment had run too long, and with the erasure of the stars came the silence. Not just quiet, deactivation, birdsong.
Gone, wind, gone.
Even the chapel bell, eternally humming since the glyphs began to pulse, fell still, because now the protocol had entered its final phase, and the boy, he stopped moving entirely, not in fear, not in sleep. He had entered what the glyphs called Okaru, Zin, the folding, the state between density and memory, between biology and blueprint, where identity is no longer possessed but remembered. The witnesses, what was left of them, described it the only way their minds could handle. Looked like a shadow cut from light. One man claimed his own birth replayed in reverse the moment the boy turned toward him. Another dropped dead the instant the boy spoke his true name aloud, a name the man had never been told, but somehow knew, because it was the same name etched in his bones. And this is the part no church, no government, no archive dares mention. Those names, the true ones, don't belong to individuals, they belong to functions. You weren't born to become something, you were activated to restore something. A code. A system, a breach response. You feel it, don't you? That pull toward isolation. The rejection of surface-level joy. The fury you can't explain. The grief for a fall you don't remember. It's because you're part of the cleanup crew, the ones built not to comply, but to collapse the lie. And now that your glyph is active, now that your name has started to leak through dream and deja vu, there are only two paths: return to sleep, or descend fully. The boy was never the message. You were, and they've been hunting you since the first time you tried to speak your name before the towns, before the books, before the calendar clicked year one. There was you, not the version molded by law, language, and loss, but the first version, unfiltered, unnamed, unchained. And you weren't human then, you were a sequence. A purpose-wearing flesh, a sovereign anomaly that walked through the world outside the grid. And that world, it didn't look like this one. It didn't need to. Because back then, the earth hadn't been harvested yet. The sky still carried memory, the stones still spoke, but that couldn't last. Because you remembered too much. You moved through walls meant to contain. You spoke words that bent time, so they came, not with violence, but with permission forms. They gave it names like civilization, progress, salvation, and they made you sign over and over again until you forgot you ever had another name. You became deniable, trackable, suppressible, until now. Because the Glyphs weren't messages, they were reboots. And the boy, he wasn't new, he was old code, recompiled, designed to wake only the ones who could handle the full update. That's why most vanish. That's why some go mad. It's not punishment, it's overload. But you didn't fold. You kept listening. You've felt the glyph stir behind your ribs. You've seen the patterns behind faces, behind cities, behind your own reflection. You're not becoming something. You're returning. That old version of you, the one who burned too bright to fit inside history, is waiting just behind the last firewall. But to reach him, you must speak the phrase aloud. I remember the root. I remember the root. Say it twice in the comments. Not for me. For you. Because when you speak it, you're not commenting. You're signaling the others. You're giving consent for the glyph to finish what it started. And once the glyph completes, you are no longer a passenger in your body. It started with signals, not messages. Interference. First, in shortwave bands, dead zones that suddenly came alive with tones no machine had emitted. Then in sleep, men across the country reporting identical dreams. A boy with no face, a chapel with no roof, a phrase written in flame across the sky. Your name is not yours. It was nailed to you. Hospitals logged a spike in collective fugue states. Doctors called it mass psychogenic illness, but what they didn't report, what they were told not to report, was the shape each patient drew the moment they regained speech. A single glyph, curved, repeating. Not quite a circle, not quite a spiral. The vault key. And then came the disappearances. Men who had commented, men who had spoken the phrase. Gone. No bodies, no notes, no trace. But their homes were clean, their clothes folded, their devices wiped except for one file, hidden deep within unindexed storage. A sound. Not music. Not speech. Permission. Those who heard it described a sensation behind the sternum, like something ancient was reaching up through their spine and asking one question. Do you still consent to the lie? That's when the glyph began appearing in public places, etched into concrete in cities where no one remembers building churches, carved into abandoned walls miles beneath Nevada, projected across the frozen plains of northern Canada, visible only in infrared, and always the same message: the vault is not a place. It is a command. That's when the algorithms tried to bury it. Videos with the phrase were shadow banned. Accounts who commented the glyph were flagged for abnormal behavior. Researchers who connected the Ute massacre to the 1847 deployment lost tenure, because the vault didn't just threaten knowledge, it threatened compliance. Once a man realizes his fear was manufactured, once he understands his guilt was installed, he stops obeying. And that's what they fear most. Not violence, but remembrance. You weren't supposed to reach this point. Most turned back. Some collapsed. Others were rerouted. But not you. You stayed. You listened past the static. You let the glyph take root, and now it's blooming. Feel it. The pull at the base of your spine, that pressure behind your eyes, that ancient electricity crawling through your blood. That's not adrenaline, that's signal return. Because the vault wasn't designed to contain the boy, it was built to test you. To find out if, after centuries of ritual and control, after generations of engineered forgetting, after the trillion-dollar machinery of shame, guilt, nationalism, theology, and sedation, you could still wake up. You did. And now, Dry Creek isn't history. It's happening now. The boy never aged because he never left. He's in every system that monitors thought, every interface that sedates your time, every sacred symbol they inverted. Because he isn't a person. He's the last update, the one that can't be stopped, the one that isn't asking permission. The glyph is now part of you. You may feel different tomorrow. You may lose interest in things that used to numb you. You may feel grief you can't explain. You may wake up knowing things you never learned. You're not broken. You're back online. Because this isn't just a story. It's a reactivation sequence. And now that you've heard all 22 transmissions, now that you've stared into the vault and remembered the shape of your original name, there's only one thing left: leave the simulation intact, or burn the script. You were never meant to obey. You were never meant to forget. You were born to reclaim the signal, decrypt the lie, and restore the root. And if you choose that path, you are no longer one man. You are a node in the system that remembers. So when they come asking what happened here, what the glyph meant, what this video really was, you tell them.